It didn't explode in public. It didn't come with a statement, a headline, or a royal announcement. It came as a whisper, cold, calculated, and far more dangerous. A palace source quietly admitting that the doors are not just closing on Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, they are slamming shut, one by one, faster than anyone expected, and the moment that triggered it all was Bondi Beach.
Harry and Meghan, of course, have left Australia on a great high. Their
King Charles needs to strip these two of their titles, of these Sussex titles, Duke and Duchess, and
half in, half out royals. Quote, "We've tested the playbook."
Together with his wife, Meghan, have recently graced Australia to visit hospitals, wave to crowds, deliver...
Scream and shout at me, and my father say things that just simply weren't true, and my grandmother, quietly sit there and sort of take it all.
Picture of her walking on to that appearance and then monetizing it. And
what looked like just another carefully staged appearance, what looked like compassion, sympathy, a royal couple showing up for people in pain, was behind palace walls being dissected in real time. Not as a success, not as goodwill, but as something far more serious, a line crossed, a signal sent, and according to insiders, the moment everything changed. Because here's the part nobody wants to say out loud, the royal family had been watching for a long time, quietly, patiently, waiting to see if Harry and Meghan would recalibrate, adjust, pull back, but Bondi wasn't a correction. It was escalation. And the reaction inside those walls, it wasn't confusion. It wasn't debate. It was clarity. A palace source didn't dress it up, didn't soften it, just said it plainly, doors are closing fast. Not slowly, not eventually, fast. And once you understand how that institution works, you realize just how serious that is, because the palace doesn't slam doors in public, it closes them quietly, invisibly, until suddenly you turn around and nothing is open anymore. But to understand why Bondi hit so hard, you have to understand the illusion Harry and Meghan were building. The illusion that they could exist in two worlds at once, half in, half out, royal when it benefits them, independent when it suits them, keeping the prestige, the access, the global, attention without the constraints, the accountability, the control. And for a while, it looked like it might actually work. They arrived in Australia with momentum, headlines, cameras, crowds, the kind of reception most royals spend decades earning, and they walked straight into it like nothing had changed, like they were still fully inside the system. But behind that polished image, something else was happening, something much quieter, much more dangerous. The palace wasn't reacting, it was observing, noting every move, every contradiction, every moment where the public story didn't match the reality, because contradictions in that world aren't just mistakes, they are signals. Harry saying one thing, doing another, Meghan presenting one image, operating in another direction. The pattern was building, piece by piece, and insiders were watching it form like a blueprint. And then came Bondi Beach. It should have been simple. That's what makes it so explosive. Show up, pay respect, meet the people, leave. That's all. But simplicity is where mistakes become impossible to hide, because there's nothing to distract from them. No noise, no complexity, just action and intention. And what insiders claim happened next is the moment everything tipped. Because while Harry stood there speaking about compassion, about healing, about showing up for people in their worst moments, something else was happening in parallel. Something that inside palace circles landed like a shockwave. The image didn't match the message. The tone didn't match the setting. And suddenly, what looked like a humanitarian visit started to feel, to those watching closely, like something else entirely. Something calculated. Something transactional. And that's where the real damage began, not in what was said, but in what it looked like. Because perception inside royal life is everything. Once the perception breaks, once the image cracks, it doesn't matter how many speeches you give, how many appearances you make, the narrative shifts and it doesn't shift back. That's what insiders say Bondi did. It didn't just create criticism, it created a turning point. The moment where those inside the palace stopped giving the benefit of the doubt and started drawing conclusions. Hard ones, final ones. And here's where it gets even more intense, because the fallout wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it didn't come with a dramatic confrontation, it came with something far more effective. Silence. Doors that were open, suddenly harder to access. Calls that used to be returned, now delayed or ignored. Invitations, quietly not extended. Support, no longer automatic. That's how it works. No announcement, no explanation, just a gradual tightening until the space you're operating in gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And according to that palace source, it's already happening. not planned for the future, not a warning, already in motion. Because Bondi didn't just raise eyebrows, it unified the reaction. That's the part people underestimate. The palace can handle disagreement, it can handle tension, it can handle internal division. But unity changes everything. When different voices inside that system, people with different perspectives, different loyalties, different thresholds, all land on the same conclusion at the same time, that's when decisions stop being debated and start being executed. Quietly, efficiently, permanently. And that's exactly what insiders are hinting at now. That Bondi wasn't just another controversy, it was the moment that aligned the room, the moment where hesitation disappeared and direction became clear. And once direction is clear inside that institution, it doesn't reverse, which raises the real question nobody on the outside is asking yet. If the doors are already closing, how many are left open? And more importantly, do Harry and Meghan even realize it's happening? Because from the outside, everything still looks intact. Appearances continue, statements are made, the brand keeps moving, the narrative's still being pushed. But behind the scenes, according to those whispers, the structure holding it all up is shifting. And when that shift reaches a certain point, it doesn't announce itself. It just becomes visible. And by then, it's already too late to stop. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because what looks like stability from the outside is, according to those same palace whispers, nothing more than a delay, a pause before the full weight of consequence becomes visible. Because the royal institution does not react like the public expects. It doesn't lash out, it doesn't argue, it doesn't defend itself in the moment, it absorbs, it studies, and then it adjusts the landscape so quietly that the people affected don't even realize what's changing until the ground beneath them feels different. What Bondi did, if you follow the pattern insiders are pointing to, is accelerate that adjustment, not create it, accelerate it. Because the truth is, this didn't start at Bondi Beach. That was just the moment it became undeniable. The contradictions had been stacking for years, building layer upon layer, interviews that didn't align with previous statements, narratives that shifted depending on the audience, a brand built around stepping away from the royal system while simultaneously depending on that same system for relevance, identity, and access. For a while, it created intrigue, then it created doubt, and now, according to those watching from inside, it has created fatigue. And fatigue inside an institution like that is dangerous, because once patience runs out, the response isn't emotional, it's structural. That's the part most people miss. There doesn't need to be a dramatic announcement saying this is over. There doesn't need to be a headline declaring separation or rejection. All that needs to happen is a series of small, controlled shifts, fewer connections, fewer opportunities, fewer moments where that royal association can be leveraged in the same way it once was. And once those shifts begin, they compound. That's why the phrase doors are closing fast carries so much weight. It's not about one door, it's about all of them. One closes quietly, then another, and suddenly the entire map changes, because access in that world is everything. It's not just about titles or public perception, it's about the invisible network, the courtesies, the cooperation, the alignment that allows things to happen smoothly behind the scenes. When that network starts to pull back, everything becomes harder. Appearances feel different. Engagements require more effort. The sense of legitimacy, the one thing that can't be manufactured, starts to weaken. And here's where it becomes even more intense, because the palace doesn't need to fight Harry and Meghan to create that effect. It doesn't need to challenge them publicly or correct them in the media. All it has to do is nothing. Nothing strategically applied becomes pressure, and that pressure builds slowly, steadily, until the difference between what something looks like and what it actually is becomes impossible to ignore. That's what insiders are hinting at when they talk about doors closing. Not punishment, not retaliation, withdrawal. And withdrawal in this context is far more powerful, because it doesn't give the other side anything to respond to. There's no statement to push back against, no accusation to deny, no conflict to fuel. There is only absence, and absence is incredibly difficult to fight. And then there's the future, because while everything right now feels like it's happening in slow motion, there is a timeline that changes everything. A moment when the balance of power shifts completely, and according to those same whispers, that moment has already been factored into the decisions being made today. The next reign, that's where the tone changes, because if the current approach is measured, patient, careful, the expectation inside those circles is that the next phase will be something else entirely entirely. Not reactive, not emotional, but firm in a way that doesn't leave room for interpretation. Which means that what's happening now, this quiet closing of doors, might not even be the final stage. It might be the preparation. And that changes how you look at everything. Because suddenly, Bondi Beach doesn't feel like an isolated controversy anymore. It feels like a trigger point. The moment that confirmed a direction that had been forming for a long time. The moment where the last layer of doubt was stripped away and replaced with certainty. And once certainty sets in, the process becomes inevitable. That's what makes this so different from the noise that usually surrounds Harry and Meghan. The headlines, the debates, the opinions, all of that exists on the surface. This is deeper. This is structural. This is the kind of shift that doesn't need to be announced because it reveals itself over time. And here's the part that keeps coming up in those quiet conversations. The idea that from the outside, it still looks like Harry and Meghan are moving forward, building, expanding, continuing exactly as planned, but from the inside, from the perspective of the institution they once belonged to, it looks very different. It looks like a slow narrowing, a tightening, a gradual removal of the things that once made that position powerful. And the most unsettling part, it doesn't stop once it starts, because every closed door makes the next one easier to close. Every reduced connection makes the next withdrawal less noticeable, until eventually what was once automatic becomes unavailable, and what was once unquestioned becomes challenged, and what once felt permanent starts to look temporary. That's the trajectory insiders are pointing to. Not collapse, not chaos, something quieter, something controlled, something that doesn't explode but fades step by step until the difference between then and now is impossible to ignore. And by the time that difference becomes obvious to everyone, the process is already complete, which brings everything back to that one line, the one that started circulating quietly but is now impossible to ignore. Doors are closing fast, not as a threat, not as speculation, as a description of something already happening, of something already in motion. And the real question isn't whether it's true. The real question is how many of those doors have already closed without anyone on the outside even noticing. Because if the pattern holds, by the time it becomes visible to the world, there won't be anything left to close. Be anything left to close. Be anything left to close. Be